Animation. Take your website from boring and sad to not boring and glad. For React developers, you really don't need to look much further than frame or motion to add interactions and animations to your websites. Whether it's scroll-based animations, hover and click effects, drag controls, layout animations, or literally anything else, Framer's declarative API lets you get up and running in just a few minutes, limited really by just your imagination. Today we're going to cover just about everything that you need to know to get your feet wet, making clean, springy interactions guaranteed to finally get your website up on mom's fridge for all of her friends to see. Anyways, that's enough for me. Let's go ahead and get started. And we are live. What's going on, guys? So just really quick, we'll take like 2 minutes before we actually get writing any code just to talk about prerequisites and what we're actually going to cover here. As far as prerequisites, the only thing that you really need to know before you actually jump into this is basic React skills. So if you understand how to take something, create a component, put it on a page with and understand props with basic React, that's really all you need to understand, as well as kind of basic CSS. You don't need to be some kind of professional front-end developer or anything. This is going to be very beginner-friendly tutorial, so long as you understand, your basic CSS properties. You understand, how to put some text on a screen with React, make it purple, whatever. You understand plenty enough to be able to understand what we're going to go over in this video. As far as what we're not going to go over in this video, first, I guess what we are going to go over in this video. I'm currently on their documentation, so this is framer.com/motion. And you're going to be able to find the same documentation that I'm looking at. Most of what we're going to be going over is this motion component. This is kind of like the atomic unit of how Framer motion works. You'll see this looks kind of like normal JSX or normal HTML, except you have this prepended little motion thing here, and you're just defining declaratively your animations directly on this component, so like on your JSX. If you're used to something more like Greenstock animation platform or something like that, most other HTML or most other JavaScript animation libraries, that's not generally how most people use Framer motion. They do have a way to do something like that. So like if you go under hooks, go to use animate, you're going to see something that looks a little more similar to something you might be used to. We're not going to talk about that in this video. In fact, we're not going to talk about most of these hooks. I'm not going to talk about useInView, or actually I am going to talk about useInView, but I'm not going to talk about use drag controls, use animation frame, use reduce motion. Most of these hooks up here, besides useScroll and useTransform, and a handful of other things here. Like we're not going to talk about reorder. We will talk about this. We won't talk about this. All of this just to say, if you do want more advanced kind of level tutorials, I do have more of those on my videos on my YouTube. Most of my videos are actually about different kinds of animations, especially the last probably month's worth of stuff, the last 8 or so videos, as well as if you're watching this in the future, I'm sure there will be many more. And most of these are breaking down significantly more complicated effects probably than what we're going to be looking at in this video, and it's a good place to go if you want to start making more advanced stuff. I also have a website called hover.dev. The link for this will be at the top of the description, I'm sure. And Hover is a library built specifically on top of React, Framer motion, and Tailwind CSS. This is just a big component library with all kinds of different components that are all animated. So some of these are free, some of them are paid. You can find like come into your hero sections or whatever and see, you can just come in, click code and grab all of the code for this. Break it down, use it in your own projects, and it'll show you how stuff like this works. Whether it's like a hero section or a pricing page or buttons or cards, you can see all the kind of different stuff we have over there. Again, a bunch of this is free. If you do want to support me, the absolute best way to do this is by grabbing a copy of Hover. It is only $37 for a lifetime subscription. I'm adding more components to this all the time, like a handful of them every week. And not only is it a good place if you're trying to build a website, but I think it's an awesome place to learn. Like a really large amount of the feedback that I've gotten from people is that they're really just using this to break down the components, understand how they work, so that they can kind of iterate on top of them and build other stuff. That said, I'm going to stop plugging this and we can go ahead and start writing some code. So let's do that. So I've already set up a bare bones React project. You should set yours up however you want. Use an existing project. Totally does not matter. I'm using a pretty bare bones Next.js project, but that's totally just my preference. If you also use Next.js, I just made a basic project and I ripped everything, kind of all of the initial stuff out. So in my index route, you'll see I've added some components. We'll talk about those in a sec, but ripped everything out of that, ripped out kind of those home modular or module CSS files, ripped out the API, and I'm just left with a completely bare bones React project with a couple of components up here, which I'll show you in a second. As far as dependencies, I've just gone ahead and installed Framer motion. So if you're using yarn or npm, it would just be yarn add Framer motion or npm install Framer motion or pnpm or whatever you're using. Just make sure that you install a package into your project called Framer motion. And beyond that, I think that that's basically it. I'm going to be doing most of my styles inline, just like with inline CSS. I will circle back to this little tiny bit, this little example button class. I mean, you can copy this right now if you want, but I want to avoid spending too much time writing styles in this. I want to just focus on the actual Framer motion stuff itself. So we'll cover a little bit of this in a minute. As far as the components that I've already made, I just wanted to make sure that I had, here, I'm gonna go ahead and close these up. Just wanted to make sure that I already had everything that I wanted to talk about kind of figured out. So don't worry, we're gonna rewrite everything, but I am gonna call this out now because if you do wanna follow along directly with the project, I have all of the code that I'm gonna write in this tutorial already broken out into components, and these will all be on my GitHub. So you can go and open that up and look at the code there just to make sure that you're not missing anything. If something's not working, you should be able to go and reference the way that I'm doing it on my GitHub. So link in the description for that. Let's go ahead and actually get started writing some code though. So the first thing that we're gonna cover, oh, by the way, I am in my basics of motion file. So if you did go ahead and open up the GitHub or clone the GitHub, this is the file that I'm in. I've just removed everything besides this wrapping div. But yeah, so as you can tell by the name of this file, let's just start by going over the absolute basics of how Framer Motion works. I have some super basic kind of stuff in here right now, and we're also gonna need that CSS class that I mentioned a second ago. So I'm just gonna add a button here in a minute. If you do wanna copy this, go ahead and copy this now. I wanna try to not spend a whole bunch of time, again, stopping and actually talking about style stuff. But this is just also not necessary. I just wanted to make sure this button didn't look completely terrible. I just added some background, some color, font size, blah, blah, blah. So copy this if you feel free. Pause right now. 3, 2, 1. Okay, we're back. And over in my component, all that I have so far, as you can see, is a div with some inline styles. All that I'm doing is giving this a display of grid, placing content center, giving it the height of the size of the screen, and then giving it some gap, which we'll need in a second, just to make it look a little bit better. The whole point of this has nothing to do with the framework. I just want to make sure everything is centered in the middle of my screen over here so that, I'm not making you guys look up here in the top left corner. That just feels weird. So we're just putting everything in the center of the screen. That is all that this is for. Now, the first thing that we're going to animate, we're not going to do anything super fancy. I just want to start with a basic box. So I'm just going to come on in here and I'm going to make a div, just a basic div, and we're just going to give this some size and make it so we can see it. So I'm going to go ahead and make some styles here. Again, just using basic inline styles. I'll give this a width of, we'll say 150 pixels. We'll give it a height of 150 pixels, just make it a square, and then some background color. I'll just go with black. That should be fine. And there we go. Sweet. We have a box on the screen. Now what we're going to talk about to start is what I like to think of as like the atomic unit of how Framer Motion works, and that is what's called the motion component. So I'm going to come up to the top of my screen, I cannot type, and I'm going to import motion from Framer Motion. And this is a really cool component. I really like how they made this work because all that you have to do to start adding your animations is prepend motion to any default HTML element. So I can come down to my div down here and I can just say motion.div. And for all intents and purposes, this is still a basic div. Like this is still going to work. You can add your styles, you can add whatever props you would normally add. If I also wanted a motion.button, you could do motion.button. If you wanted an anchor tag, you could do that. If you wanted a list item or whatever, an unordered list, this will work with any HTML element so long as you just prepend it with motion dot. So to start adding a basic animation, so what we'll start with is I just want, whenever this page mounts, I just want this box to rotate. That seems like probably the easiest thing. We'll just do like 180 degrees rotation. And there are a couple of props that are added whenever we add this motion dot to the beginning of our HTML elements, which let us define kind of how our the different states of our animations work. And we call those variants. And the first two and kind of most important variants are the initial variant. I'm just going to start by doing this. This is going to take in an object, and the animate variant. Animate really is kind of the most important one. Oops. Animate. And how you can think that these work is that these are just going to take in the same kind of props as what your normal style tag is going to take. So I could add any normal CSS selectors in here. Like I could do, a background if I wanted. I could do color. I could do margin. I could do translate. They also give you some shorthands, like they give you X instead of having to do translate X, stuff like that, which is kind of nice. We won't go into all the specifics of that. But like I said, for right now, we're just going to start with rotate. So I'll go ahead and add a rotate of 0 degrees. And this is going to be the initial state whenever my component first mounts, right? And animate is going to be the state that we want this to animate to. So whenever I want this to mount, I want this, I'm just going to copy paste this down. I just want to start by rotating this 180 degrees. Oh, cool. And we'll see we already got something over here. So now every time I refresh the screen, we're going to see we get this kind of quick transition where it just spins in a circle. Now that is a little bit fast. We can play around with the timing and like the easing functions, similar to how you would with a normal CSS transition, like a keyframes transition, by just adding the transition prop. So this is kind of probably the third most important prop that motion or frame motion is going to give you out of the box. And this will take a whole bunch of different things. You can get into like staggering and all kinds of other cool stuff. But the main one that we care about to start, or the main two, I guess, are duration. So that is exactly what it sounds. I could say 1 second, and maybe we'll go over and refresh, and we'll see that this goes much slower now. As well as easing. And there's a couple different types of easing. So you'll see, actually, if I remove this really quick and refresh, see how it kind of looks like it has like a little physics effect like that? How it kind of goes past and like kind of jiggles a little bit, like has a spring animation built in by default. You'll see whenever I add a transition just with a duration, that's going to go away. Like it's just going to kind of give you a linear animation. If you wanted to add that back in, you would come down here and you would say type of spring. And there's some other things that you can add in to kind of define how springy it is. Those are things like damping. And I'm not going to go over all the specifics of spring easing in this, but you can feel free to look into the documentation again for that. And now we'll see we have a little bit of our springiness back, but we haven't gotten all of the specifics down just yet. I actually don't want to use spring easing for this. I want to play with ease because that's probably a little closer to what most people are used to. So if you ever have used keyframes animations, you've probably done something like ease in out, and you'll see once you type in ease, you get everything that you're probably used to. You can go ahead and play with all of these. They're all just going to be kind of different curves that your animation is going to follow. The one that I like, there's a couple of them I like back in out is kind of nice. You see how that gives you kind of like a little bit more structured version of that springiness effect, but it's not going to wobble all over the place. That one looks kind of cool. We can just stick with that one for now. Now, there's actually one other state besides initial, animate, and exit, and that is, or initial and animate, sorry, and that is exit. So I'm going to go ahead and say exit. And what exit's going to do is whenever this component unmounts from the screen, it's going to then animate to that spot before actually unmounting. So I don't actually have a good way of showing this right now. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm going to add a button. Just say button up here. And this is why I made that class name earlier. So go back and grab that if you haven't already. That's just example button. I just am too OCD to like leave a button not looking okay. Those class names again are these. So one more chance to pause and just copy them if you want them. Do them in line, doesn't really matter. And I'm just going to make this we'll say show/hide because that's what we're going to be doing. Cool, we have a button. And all that I want this to do is I want it to, whenever some Boolean is true, I want it to show that box, and whenever it's false, I want it to hide. So we'll just say is visible, something like that. Set is visible. Having a really tough time right now for some reason. And I'm just going to set that to a piece of state using useState. Set that to, well, we'll say true to start. Now I'm going to go ahead and wrap our motion.div down here with some brackets. And I'm just going to say if this is visible, then we want to show it, else we don't want to show anything. And we actually have to toggle that using this button. So I will add an on click to our button. Sorry, this is all just kind of set up. This isn't the fun stuff yet. I promise we're getting there. But then whenever we set is visible, whenever we click this button, I just want to change it from whatever the current state is to the opposite. So if it's visible, I want to make it not visible. If it's not visible, I want to make it visible. And now we should have what we're looking for. So if I go ahead and click this, you will see that it actually is not animating out. Once I add it back in, it's going to animate out again. So that's cool. Whenever it leaves, it is not going to. And that is because we actually have to use one other component that we get from FramerMotion to make this work. That component back up here at the top is called AnimatePresence. So anytime that you want to use, oops, I just almost broke everything. Anytime that you want to use the exit prop to add unmount animations, all that you have to do is you have to wrap that component, or you have to wrap not just that component, but wherever you're actually doing the toggling with this AnimatePresence prop. So I'm gonna go ahead and do that. It'll look like this. And now we should see that that works, right? So like as it goes away, all that we're defining right now is that we want this to then rotate back out, back to 0 degrees. And that is cool. I think this will be a little bit more obvious if we also add maybe like scale. So let's say we start the scale at 0. And then whenever we animate in, we put the scale, we put the scale back up to 1. And then maybe on exit, again, we go back out to 0. Refresh. Now we see that it kind of pops in, and as it goes out, it kind of goes down like that, and that looks pretty cool. Now, one other small thing that I just wanted to show, I actually didn't have this on my list, but I think this is a good time to show this, is we'll notice like whenever this animation stops, our button is just gonna kind of fly back into that space without animating wherever our box was here. And the first thing that I want to show you guys for how we can fix that is the different modes for how AnimatePresence works. So if you type in mode and go like this, you should see that there's a couple of different versions here. And if you go to pop layout, that is going to actually remove this from the flow. So you see how my button kind of like flies down. It doesn't wait for this to go away. That's because it's actually removing this black box from the DOM before it actually does the animation, which gives the space back to this button so it can go there first. And if the button is just kind of sliding in, that might look a little bit stupid. But what we can do again is go over to our button here. And remember, we can prepend literally anything with motion dot. And there's this really cool extra prop. I wasn't, again, planning on going into this, but I think this is a cool opportunity to show this. And if you just add layout like this to any component, it's going to automatically move it from wherever it is at one point to whenever it repaints to another location. That may or may not make sense, but you'll see what it looks like here in a second. So whenever this unmounts now, see how the button kind of like slides down? All that I had to do for that was add one extra little prop. So that's super, super, super handy. One thing that you will notice, you're not seeing it here, is that you will get a little bit of distortion sometimes depending on where and how big the component is that you're adding layout to. Another thing that I'm not going to dig into right now. But if you do run into an issue with that, let me know. Maybe I can do a deeper dive on layout animations. Now, one other thing that you may be used to with something like keyframes animations that we're not really doing here is actually adding keyframes. So really right now, all that we have is like one stop, right? Like if I open this back up, it's just saying, hey, I want to go from one value to another value to another value. But what if you wanted to go between a handful of values? So like what if you wanted this to rotate 180 degrees and then rotate back 360 degrees and then rotate a little bit up or something like that, right? And there actually is a way to do that. And I'm going to leave all of these as they are. So we'll go ahead and just add a new value. We'll make that Y. So Y is going to be the same as like translate Y or transform in the Y axis. They just give you this kind of shorthand for it where you can just type in Y. And let's just start by saying, we'll start this at 0 and then maybe whenever we won't add keyframes yet. We'll just say we'll animate this to 50 or something, and then it'll go back to 0. So see that kind of goes down. Cool. And then when it comes in, yeah, whatever. Anyways, what we can do if for this animation, let's say that I want this to kind of dip down. So I go down on the y-axis and then go way up and then go, maybe hold up there for a second and then go back down, is instead of just using one value, I can pass in, and this is in my animate prop, by the way, I can pass in an array with as many values as I want. So I'm referencing over to my old example here. And you can do something like, say, we'll start at a translate of 0, and then we'll say that I want to go to maybe 150 pixels down, and then maybe 150 pixels back up. And then maybe we want to stay there for a second. So I'll say minus 150, minus 150, and then back down to 0, something like that. If I refresh now, we should see that this does a whole bunch of stuff. So it looks pretty cool, right? So as it comes back in, flies up, flies back down. That is pretty dope. One other thing you might want to do with this, though, is actually define the percentages of all of these different stops. So again, if you've used something like keyframes animations before, you'll normally say at like 0%, I want it to be this value, and then 50%, I want it to be this value, and then 55, this value, something like that. You can do that as well. And that is just one extra value we're going to add down to our transition prop, which is called times. So the duration is always going to be whatever the duration is right here. But you can break down the times. This should be the same width as however long your keyframes are. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So we need 5 times here. And those times are just going to be values between 0 and 1, with 0 being 0 seconds and 1 being however long your duration is. So if I had a duration of 5 seconds, a value of 1 in here would mean all the way at 5 seconds. Hopefully that makes sense. For something like this, the value that I used last time, we could say like, okay, at 0%, we want to be at a value of 0 on the y-axis, and at say 25%, we want to be at our first value of 150. Then at halfway through, I want to be at minus 150. Then I want to hold there maybe for a while. So we could say like 0.95, something like that. I'll say like 85. And then finally, we'll come back down to our last 0 again. So this is just going to let us kind of hold on to that top, like that stall at the top between minus 150 for a little bit longer. If I refresh now, cool. You see how it kind of looks like it like holds up there at the top a little bit longer. Now that we've defined those times, you can play with these, make them do whatever you want. But that's basically all you need to know for the absolute basics of framer motion. Now that we have this covered, we can go ahead and move over to gestures. So I'm going to cut really quick. I'm going to make sure I save this piece of video, and remember that all of this code, again, will be on GitHub. So go ahead and grab that there if any of this did not work for you. All right, so we're going to switch over to gestures. If you're following along with my repo, like just go into your index file and you can switch over components. Let me see, I have to make sure I have everything open. I did not rename that, did I? Okay, sweet, oops. I'm actually gonna rename this file. I won't make you watch all of this. I'm gonna call this gestures. Sweet, I guess motion config was actually an acceptable name for this as well. And also, I guess I should also remove all of this because you guys don't need to see all of this yet. And bam. Okay, cool. So our starting point here is essentially exactly the same as our starting point for our other one. So just a wrapping div with some styles on it to put stuff on the center, nothing else. Now, the idea behind what I want to show you guys in this part is just that, you know, in our last little section there, all that we were doing was doing kind of like animations on mount and on exit, which is cool, but I think more often than not, you're wanting to do animations when some action happens, right? And the most common of those are probably whenever you hover over something or when you click like something like a button. So I just want to cover really quick how you would go about doing something like that. Super, super simple. And we can go ahead and get started. I'm going to stop blabbering on. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to make a button, and I'm going to use that same class that I had from the last one. So we'll say class name, and it was example button, like that. And we'll just do something like click me, is what I did last time. Sweet, dope. Okay, we have a button here. Now, what if we wanted to make something happen whenever we click this button? Well, the first thing that we know from the last example is we're going to prepend our button with motion dot, and I haven't imported that yet. So import motion, motion from framer motion. And now nothing has changed, but we do have our super powered component here. And we've learned about variants. Well, there's a couple of other variants for gestures, and you can see what all of those are by typing in while. So you should get some kind of autocomplete here. whileTap is kind of like whileClick. They just call it tap, which I guess makes sense. And we're going to go over that as well as whileHover. Those are probably the two main ones. We'll go over whileInView in a minute, and for whileDrag and whileFocus, you can check those out on your own time. Those are probably a little less commonly used. But we'll say just start whenever we hover something, how do we want this to work? So I'm going to say whileHover, and this is going to work exactly like any of our other variants. So we can just type in our normal CSS classes in here. I'm going to say whenever I hover this, I want this to go to a scale of, say, 1.05. There we go. See if that worked. Beautiful. Now we have our little button scaling up. And now whenever I click this, maybe I want to scale this back into the page. I'm just going to copy all of this. I'm going to be using scale for that as well. And we'll change this to whileTap. whileTap, and then maybe whenever we tap, we want to go to, what did I do last time? 0.95, something like that. And let's just add a little bit something else to kind of spruce it up. We'll maybe also rotate it. And we'll say rotate, say 2.5 degrees. So now whenever I hover over this and I click on it, it's going to go back into the page and kind of rotate. Super, super cool. And it's just that easy. You can just drop in your little props like this, add whatever variants you want, and it's going to work. I want to talk about one other thing kind of while I'm in here, and that is how you define transitions for multiple components. So pretend like you had this same kind of effect. Let's start by just defining a transition here. So we'll say transition is equal to, let's say duration. We want this to be pretty quick probably. So say 0.125, and then maybe for the easing, we'll do, just pick one, ease in out. Cool, works with me. So now it should look a little bit different from last time. I mean, it's pretty quick, so you're not going to see a big difference. But pretend for whatever reason this is exactly the duration that you wanted. And then you had a second button here. I'm going to drop one down here. Maybe this button's a little different. Maybe this has like a style of a, we'll say, background color of red, something like that. What did I just do? Oh, I see. There we go. Background color red, cool. So the exact same button. Maybe this is slightly different, whatever. Pretend this is a different component for whatever reason. Just change a couple of values here. Sweet, awesome. But we have two different buttons. And we want both of these to have the same transitions, right? Maybe this is actually easier if I just bump it up. Pretend this is 0.5 or something for this one. So way slower, but just for purpose of showing kind of what we're doing here. Pretend you wanted this same kind of slow transition on all of your different interactions, right? Well, one way that you could do that, actually that's gonna make me angry. I'm going back to 1.25. But pretend you wanted the same values and the same easing and everything on multiple components. Well, it's kind of annoying to have to copy and paste that all over the place. So what you can actually do is use a motion config. So this is something kind of like a context provider. In fact, I think it just is a context provider. But if you pull in motion config from Framer Motion, you can just wrap this around specific pieces of your app and then define the transition in one spot and it will apply it everywhere. So if I do motion config up here, I can just wrap this around both of my buttons like this. Cool. And then I can just take my transition and instead of putting it on my buttons, I can just put it on my motion config. So I'll come up here like this, drop it up here, and let's make this, a different value so we can really see the difference. Whatever, we'll go back to 0.5. So now both of these should be kind of slow. So I'll go over that one, kind of slow, kind of slow. If I speed it up in this one spot, back to 1.25, it should speed it up in both ways. This way we don't have to worry about defining our transitions everywhere over and over again and making sure that they all match. So yeah, just a quick little thing that I wanted to call out while we were going over these gestures. I think now we can move on to a couple of other things. So for this example, we're kind of talking about how we trigger animations with these specific controls like this, but there might be some other cases where you click on a button and then you want something to happen somewhere else on the page, and we're going to switch over gears and see how we would do that. I'm back over in my index.js file, and I'm going to remove my gestures, and I'm going to switch over to this animation controls. Let me go ahead and go into this. So if you're following along again, let me copy this 1 sec, put this on the side so I can still see it, and just like last time, get back to a clean slate where we have nothing but our little wrapping div, putting everything in the middle. There we go. Sweet. Yeah, so as I was saying, again, if you want to grab this from GitHub, go ahead and jump in there and you can follow along, else just type along with me. So the problem that we're actually trying to solve here, you would have seen this a second ago. I don't know why that didn't refresh. There we go. That was odd. Okay, so the problem that we're trying to solve here, let me actually open back up our gestures components. Like I kind of mentioned a second ago, is these gestures are going to run whenever you do something on this component, right? So it's like whileHover or whileTapping on this specific component. I want to do something. But what if you want an action on one part of the page? So say clicking on this button from our last example to do something on some other part of the page. So for whatever reason, maybe you want clicking on this button to make this button blue. That would be kind of silly, but you get the idea. The way that we can do that is using animation controls, thus the name of this component. So I'm going to start by coming on in here, and I'm just going to add a div inside of this. This is going to be kind of a contrived example, but you can see how you could use this to make something a little bit more complicated. I'm going to go ahead and add a div, and we're again just going to kind of make a square in here. So we'll say style. I'll give this a width of 150 again, height of 150, and then give this a background color of black. Let's see, should have my box there now. Perfect. And then above that, I'm going to add a button. So we'll say button again. This will have our class names for our buttons. So example button, beautiful. And we can just make this a flip it. That's what I did last time. Cool. So essentially what I want to have happen here for this example is whenever I click on this button, I want to do something to this div. In this case, I just want to make this div kind of rotate 360 degrees. But you could think of an example where it's like maybe this button is submitting a form and that causes like some confetti to fly all over the screen. Or you click on this button and it causes maybe like a slide out modal to come out from the right side or something along those lines. This is generally how I would go about doing something like that. And the way that you do that, first we're going to actually, before we get to how we're going to do that, I want to define our variants. So I'm going to start by importing motion from Framer Motion again, and I'm just going to add, I'm not going to worry about doing this anything to the button. I'm just going to add this to the div here. So I'm going to say motion dot per usual. And I'm going to define our variants a little bit differently this time. So the last kind of couple of examples, if I go in here, we've defined our variants directly in line with whatever our props are, but you can actually define as many sets of variants as you want, and then just refer to them by string. So that may or may not make sense, but the idea is this. So I can go ahead and add a prop called variants, and then I can just give a key of whatever I want. So say initial generally would make sense, and maybe that's a rotate of 0 degrees. And then I could add another one where it doesn't need to be animated, it can be whatever you want. So in this case, I'm gonna say flip, and I'm gonna give that a rotate of, let me scroll this back in view, sorry. A rotate of 360 degrees. And what did I do wrong? Oh, no comma, nice. I'm not gonna have as many of these as I wanted. So I could have like flip, I could have like, banana, and banana could, rotate it way, way more for whatever reason. That would be cool. And then you can just refer to these at any point by string. So using our normal example, I could say like whileHover or something like that, and then just refer to the string as opposed to passing in, the whole object. I could just say whileHover, I want this to flip. And there we go, sweet. So I don't know why I keep having to like refresh there, that's odd. But now whenever I hover over this, we're gonna see that we actually get our variant. And we didn't define it in line with just the classes, we just defined it with the variants here, which is nice because then you can pull all of this out, you can put it in a separate variable, and then you can refer to those same things just by string in multiple different locations, which is really, really nice. But this is not what we want to do. We do not want to do this while hover. What we want to do is whenever we click on this button, we want to go from our initial state to our flip state. So I am going to actually, I'll say initial down here. I just want to set that to initial, meaning that this kind of string of initial is referring to this set of classes again. And then whenever I click on this, I'm just going to fire some function, which we'll see how that works right now. So I'm going to come up here. We'll say on click, I want something to happen. I'll define it outside of here. So we'll say handle click. And then we actually have to define our function up here at the top. Say const handle click equal to some function that is going to do, man, I'm having issues, is going to do something. Sweet. And what is the thing that we want to do? Well, the thing that we want to do is we want to target our div here, and we want to switch it from our initial variants to our flip variants. And the way that we do that is using a hook that we get from FramerMotion called useAnimationControls. So I'm going to come up here. I'm going to import useAnimationControls. We'll see it right there. And this is going to return us back just an object like this. So we're going to say const controls. You can call this whatever you want. It's equal to useAnimationControls. I could call this flip controls if that makes more sense, whatever kind of makes sense to you. And in some cases you might have 5 different instances of this, so you'll want to name it something different. But by default, I normally just name it controls. And then what you do with this is you come down into whichever item that you're actually targeting, and you switch or you pass this in to the animate prop. So instead of how we normally would pass in our styles in here, we're just going to pass in our controls like this. And on our controls, we have, as you would suspect, some controls. So if I come in here and say controls dot, we'll see what those are. We have mount, start, stop, and set. The one that we care about right now is start. And that's all that we're actually going to cover for right this second. So start is just going to take in, if we read this, we can actually add the specific, similar to any other variant, you can just pass in the styles directly. But because we've already defined ours as a variant down here, we can just pass in a string that says flip. So following through one more time, we're going to click on this button. This button is going to fire this function, which does not need this comments anymore. And this is going to hit our controls, start this variant, and then this variant is defined down here, which is going to say rotate 360 degrees, which should now work. Sweet. We're going to see it doesn't work over and over again because now we're actually at 360 degrees. But every time I refresh this now, I should be able to click that and get our animation. And that's pretty much it. So anytime that you want one action to fire some other action, I generally would do that using these animation controls. So now that we've learned how to fire animations based on normal gestures as well as separately from some other function, let's learn how we can do it based on the viewport position. So like when something comes into view. So hopefully you're starting to see a pattern here. I'm back over in my index.js file, and I'm just switching from that animation controls component to a new one that I'm calling view-based animations. Again, I'm going to grab all of this, one sec, drop it in my screen on the side. And then we'll go again back to a pretty empty state. This is going to be a little bit different this time though. So let's remove all this, and for the time being, we can remove this and remove all of this. Sweet. Blank slate. Okay, so what I have right now is just a fragment component up here, and then I have a div with a little bit different styling. I'm just giving this a height of a little bit higher than the size of the screen. And that's because I want to be able to scroll here. So I don't know if you guys can see my scroll bar over on the right, but I want to make sure that I have some distance to scroll up and down so that we can scroll things into the viewport and trigger animations based on that. There's actually 2 different ways that we can do this, and I'm going to show you. The first one is going to look very similar to what we've already looked at. And to do that, let's go ahead and re-import motion actually. So import motion from FramerMotion. We're just going to do a really simple example. I just want to take a box and turn it from one color to another color. Actually, we'll start with opacity. So let's just do a motion.div right here. I'm just going to close that off on itself. And then we'll give this some style to start. We'll say this is, say, the height of the screen. So 100 viewport height. and then give this some background. We'll just say background of black, doesn't really matter. You could also imagine that this is just, a single component, like a button or some animation that you want to fire within, some larger part of the page. I just don't want to have to spend a bunch of time walking through making something super, super fancy just to get this point across. But point being, so what I want to do here is I want to say my initial state. For initial, we'll just go with we'll just say like an opacity of 0. We'll just go from one opacity to another opacity here. So opacity of 0. And then remember how we had like whileHover and whileTap and stuff? We'll see we also have whileInView, which is right here. And that's going to work the exact same way. So what I'm going to say here is I want whenever this element is in view to switch the opacity from 0 to 1. So our initial opacity is 0. And when we're in view, the opacity is going to switch over to 1. I'm also going to give this some transition because it's going to be really fast if we don't do this otherwise. So we'll say transition is equal to a duration of, we'll say 1 second, something like that. And now as I scroll down, we haven't actually run into the box yet. Once that box starts to come into view, see how it kind of fades in instead of just popping in automatically. As I scroll back up and down, you should keep seeing this happening over and over again. This is essentially all that you have to do. So obviously I'm doing a super, super simple example here, but if you do have something where you can just define it in one spot like this, the easiest way is just using the whileInView variant over here directly on your motion components. Now, like I said, there's more than one way to actually do this. And the other way is for probably a little bit more complicated examples. I'm going to show a pretty simple example, but I think you'll run into examples where you might want to reach out to this instead of using this whileInView, specifically if you want to trigger a whole bunch of different animations at once. And that is using the useInView hook, which also comes from Framer Motion. We'll also need a useRef hook from React, and we'll start with that. I'll show you why in a second. So I'm going to start by defining a ref. So ref is equal to useRef. And useRef is going to be imported from React up here at the top. We can just start this off as null. And I want actually to add a new div down here. So let's see. Actually, I'm just going to copy it in. Well, no, I won't. I lied. I will write it in. So we'll just start a new div down here. Our ref, so that what we just defined above, we're just going to assign to this div. So we're just saying, hey, this reference, this constant that we're adding up here, is a reference to this element down here. That's pretty much all that we're saying right there. And then again, I'm just going to give this some styles. So we'll say another height of 100 viewport height. We'll give this some color to start. We'll say background of red is fine. And then I also want to add a transition to this so we can transition between the two colors. And I'll say 1 second background, something like that. Cool. All right. So if I scroll down now, I should have a red box down here. Cool. That is a perfectly good start. And now to actually use this, like to do something with this ref specifically, we want to use the useInView hook. So I'll come in here and define that. Say const is in view. It's just going to return a Boolean that's either true or false. And that is equal to useInView, which comes from Framer Motion right here. And this is going to take in 2 values. We'll start with just one, and then we'll come back to the other one. So the first one is this ref, which we defined. And then the second one is going to be some options. It's going to look like this. We'll come back to that in just a second. Just start with just your ref in here. Before we actually apply this to anything, I just want to show you that this is firing. So you don't have to follow this if you don't want. I just want to kind of show this as an example. And I'm going to do that using a use effect. And in that use effect, in the dependency array, I'll pass in our isInView. And I just want to console log this out. So we'll say console.log. Say isInView, something like that, and then print out what the value is. Open up my console here, bump up the size a little bit. Now as I scroll down, we should see that, yes, our red box is in view. As soon as it leaves, goes back to false, back to true, back to false. And you could use this Boolean to do whatever you wanted. If you wanted for some reason to fire off an API request or something, you could do that. It does not need to be tied to a animation per se. Like you'll see essentially what I'm going to do down here. I'm not going to turn this into a motion.div. I'm just going to keep a normal transition here. But this is really just a helper function. Like this is just a helper hook that you can use for whatever you want. Generally you're probably going to use this for animations, but there are other cases where you might reach out to this and just be like, okay, I want to, whenever something comes into view, I want to whatever, pick your thing that you may want to do in that case. It's kind of up to your imagination. But for our case, we do want to actually change something. So all that I'm going to do is I'm going to take my isInView hook here, and on our background color directly in our style, we'll say if it is in view, we'll make it some other color. We'll say blue. That's fine. And now as I scroll down, we'll see that we get kind of a similar thing. We're going from red to blue as soon as this gets back in view, right? This is pretty cool as it is. One other thing that might be annoying though to your users, depending on the use case, is if this fires every single time, right? Like you'll see it just keeps going over and over and over again. And that is where our options come in our useInView hook right here. So I mentioned there was a second option you can pass in here. And the kind of important thing that you're going to want to pass in here, you'll see there's a couple of other options, which I'll let you read into if you want to in your own time. But what I care about is once, which is just a Boolean. And if you set once to true, then this is only going to fire one time. So now we'll see as I go back in and out, it's not going to keep switching back and forth. Let me actually refresh so we can see that again. So now as I scroll down, animation fires one time, but as it leaves the screen again, now if I go back in, it's not going to do it again. So if you have like some kind of cool entrance animation or something that you're firing and you don't want it to go every time, this is probably how you would want to go about doing it. And that is it for view-based animations. Let's go on to our last main topic, which is scroll-based animations. All right, our last time doing this. So I'm back over in my index.js and I'm going to switch one more time. So I want to go from my view-based animations to my scroll animations right here. And I just realized I did not add padding, so that's gonna look stupid. I'll have to remember to fix that in a second. But for now, I'm gonna go ahead and remove a decent chunk of what we have in here. This is my file, I can close this one. I can delete all of this stuff, and I can delete this stuff right here. Cool, I'm gonna actually add one more thing before I walk through this because this does look a little silly. Let's say style equals a padding, say like 1.2 rem, something like that. Cool, sweet, looks good to me. So all that we're doing here, all that I have in here to start, actually I'm also gonna add this down here because I already have a style tag and I don't want to do more than I need to do. So we'll go like this. Perfect. So I've just added a bunch of fake lorem ipsum text in here. Again, just so I have some room to scroll. You can pretend like this is a blog post for this example. But just add a bunch of random text. It could just be random blocks of divs with different heights too. If you just want to follow along, it doesn't need to be text. This just felt a little bit more realistic, so I decided to go ahead and go with divs with like a fake blog post type format. But what I want to do for this example, I don't know if you saw it a second ago, is up here at the top, hopefully you can see my cursor here, I want to have some kind of progress bar. Like you've probably seen this before on different blogs. Like as you scroll down, you'll have a little progress indicator showing how far down the page you've actually scrolled, so you know how much more you have to read. That's exactly what we're going to add for this. And the main thing that we need for this is a hook called the useInScroll hook, or the useScroll hook from Framer Motion, which I'm just going to import, and I'll kind of show you what the different values are before I go ahead and add the div and everything like that. So let's just define that. We'll say useScroll. That imports from Framer Motion, and this does not take any parameters. And this is going to return a couple of different things for us. So if you just type in the word scroll, you'll see our different options here. The scroll progress, so like scroll X and scroll Y progress, are going to be a value between 0 and 1. And then X and Y, if I remember correctly, are just like the absolute values. So like scroll Y would just be, 1500 pixels or something like that. Whereas scroll Y progress will be a value between 0 to 1, which is like 0% to 100%, right? Something like that. And okay, we actually want to be able to use this, right? So that would be cool to show. So I'm going to import motion again. And to make our little top div thing, all that I'm going to do is I'm going to come up here and I'll say motion.div. Again, we should be used to this by now. I did this the wrong way. Better. And we have to add some styling for this. Let me look over to make sure I'm using the same colors and everything as last time. I'm actually just going to drop a bunch of this in here. Let's see. So I'll say style, like that. I'm going to drop these in. I also need a background color, which I did not copy from there. Background color blue. Oops. Really? Oh, oops. That would be why. Can delete that. There we go. Nice. Okay, cool. So now we just have a box up on the top of the screen. See, we have like this blue thing, right? And what we're doing right now is it's just staying up there sticky to the top of the screen. So I have position sticky, top of 0, width of 100%, a height, I'm just setting 20 pixels, and then a transform origin of left, or background color blue too. So these down here are kind of like our actual styles. And then I'm setting a transform origin of left because I want to scale this from the left side of the page. So if I didn't do that, I mean, I can remove it in a second and actually show you. We would be scaling from the middle of this bar out as opposed to left to right, which might look a little ridiculous. And we can actually just show that really quick. So I don't even need to do anything extra here to get a basic effect here. Inside of my motion div, just directly inside of the styles, not inside of animate or anything like that, I want to pass in a scale of X. And because this value is already a motion value and it's a value of 0 to 1, then we can just pass it directly like this to our scale value. So if we go like that, what am I doing wrong? Oh, scale X progress. I'm an idiot. Scale Y progress. I'm sitting here refreshing like, what did I do wrong? But there we go. Scale Y progress. Man, I just took, you guys didn't see it, but I just took like 20 seconds trying to figure out what I did wrong there. Scale Y progress, not scale X progress. But we do want to do a scale of X. Nice. All right. So now we should see as I scroll down, we get our bar that we're looking for. Just slowly until we get all the way down to the bottom, it should fill all the way up to the right side. What I was saying a second ago about transform origin. So if I remove this, the default is going to be center. And now as we scroll down, we're going to see that it kind of comes from the middle. So that's all that I was doing there by defining our transform origin to left instead of the default, which is middle. So I can go ahead and remove that. One thing you're going to see that we don't have with this is that kind of springy effect that we normally get by default, which I guess makes sense because this is kind of like an absolute value. But if you did want to add a kind of springiness back to this animation, what you can do is use the useSpring hook, which is another hook that comes from Framer Motion. So we'll just pass that in. And this hook is just going to take any motion value. So in this case, this scroll Y progress. And I'm just going to call it scale X because that's what it's going to be equal to. I can just import useScroll, which is also, or not useScroll, geez. useSpring is what I want. useSpring. There we go. Nice. So now we have useSpring. And this value will take in our scroll Y progress. It could take in any other motion value. All it's going to do is take in some static motion value and give it that kind of springy effect that you're used to seeing. So we can pass this in here instead of our scroll Y progress. I'll actually leave that there and make a new version so we can see both, or so that you have both when you go back to reference this, and just replace that with our spring-based value. And we should now see that we get like this spring, right? Like as I go up and down, it kind of like overshoots a little bit and undershoots, and we get like our cool springy value still, which is really, really nice for how easy they make that to do. Now, one other thing that you might want to do, like this is a little bit limited as is, right? Because you just have scroll Y, which just turns into a 0 or a 1. But what if you wanted this to say affect the color? Like maybe you wanted this to start at, purple and then become yellow when you get all the way to the right or something like that. Or whatever, you wanted to affect anything else that isn't just a value between 0 and 1. You wouldn't be able to do that by default by just like, if you were to console log this out, you're going to see this isn't actually a value of just 0 to 1. So you can't just like multiply it or try and do that math yourself. It's actually what they call a motion value, which is another thing I'll let you kind of read more into if you like. But fortunately, they do have a really simple to use hook out of the box called useTransform, which lets you transform any one value into any other value. So how that's going to work, in our case, I'm just going to go with background. So our background right now is just this blue color. I'm going to change that here in a second. I'm going to say const, and we'll say background just so we can pass it right in. And I'll set that equal to useTransform, which also comes out of Framer Motion. And this is going to take 3 arguments. So the first one, similar to this, is just going to take in our scroll Y progress. It's just going to be any motion value. And then this is kind of where the fun part comes in. It's a little bit confusing. I'm going to try and do my best to explain this, but it might be easiest to just play with this yourself to really get a deep understanding of this. But this second argument is going to be a map of values from, or an array of values that you want to map from. So in our case, this value starts at 0 and animates, 0 and animates to 1. So I'm going to start my first value at 0 and it's going to end at 1. If I wanted 3 values in here, if I said I wanted to go from 0% to at 25%, I want it to be some other color and then animate between those 2 colors, I could do that as well. But I'm just going to go between 0 and 1 for now. And then the third argument is going to be what you want those values to be transformed into. I have 2 values. I have to copy them from over here so I don't have to try and rewrite these RGB values. But what I'm saying is, okay, when this value is at 0, so when scroll Y progress is all the way up at the top and the value is 0, I want that to equal this RGB value here. When it's all the way at the bottom where the value is 1, I want it to be this value right here. And I'll just say it one more time, for example. Pretend I wanted at 25% to have some other color. I'll just drop in the same ones. Oops. And just go ahead and remove that. and whatever, like just make some random change to this, say 100 or something. If for whatever reason I wanted that 25% to go from this color to this color, and then from 25% to 100% to go from this color to this color, I could do that. I am not going to do that, especially because I haven't already tested that. I'm just going to go back to our basic example here, like this. Now I need to actually use this. I was just about to scroll and I was like, oh wait, that's not going to work. So I'm going to take my background here, and similar to what I did with scale, I'm going to comment out the original background just so we still have that. I'm going to drop my background color in like this, and let's scroll, see if I messed anything up. Nope. See, cool. So as we start up at the top, we have this kind of like bluish color. And as we go down, we get this smooth transition from that blue to a green color down at the bottom. So super cool. And again, you could use this to transform between just about anything. In their documentation, they will talk about the acceptable values here. Like you can map to different sets of numbers. You can go between hex values. You can go between RGB values. There are all kinds of different stuff that you can kind of transform between, but there probably are some limitations. So go ahead and check that out just to make sure, if you're trying to use two different values here and they're not working, it's probably just because they're not actually supported values. One example would just be like CSS shorthand colors. I've seen that. I don't believe that works. I can try it right here, real time. Let's see, maybe I'm wrong. Do like blue, red, something like that. Yeah, so like that does not work for whatever reason. So you might actually have to just use hex or RGB or something like that, which I guess makes sense. Like I'm sure they're just doing some kind of math on the numbers. But anyways, this is the basis of it. So that's pretty much everything you need to know to do basic scroll-based animations, or even advanced scroll-based animations. I mean, I've done some pretty cool stuff just with useTransform, just taking one value and turning it into multiple other values. And that's a wrap. So one last call out that all of this will be on GitHub. If any of this was confusing to you, I promise if you just go and spend a little bit of time digging through it, I don't think it should be too hard. If you do get really stuck on something, feel free to leave a message below or leave a comment below, and I'll do my best to get back to anybody who has any questions. As far as learning further stuff, I'll just call this out one more time. I know I said this at the beginning, but their documentation is fantastic. Just about everything has like a code sandbox, which actually has a version of how this works. So if you want to dig into anything more specific inside, or even anything that we've talked about in here more specifically, I'm sure I didn't talk about everything, please check out their documentation. It is fantastic. And that link again will be in the description. I believe it's framer.com/motion. One last call out for my website for hover.dev. That will also be down in the description. If you want to play around with some examples of like pre-built components and even be able to use them in your own projects, you can just drag and drop any of these with code. Just come in here. All this is available in both JavaScript and TypeScript using Tailwind. You can go and check that out as well. Beyond that, if you learned anything from this, a like and a subscribe would mean the world to me. I'm really doing my best to start picking up the pace over here on YouTube. I have done plenty of stuff on other platforms, but I'm a really, a YouTube person first, and I've kind of neglected the amount of video content that I put out here. So being able to see that there's some love below just with likes and subscriptions would really give me a big motivation to keep making more tutorials like this one, more longer form stuff that's digging a little bit deeper than I think some of the stuff that I've done before. So yeah, that would mean a lot if you guys could do that. Beyond that, let me know if there's anything else you want to learn beyond just questions, if there's any other specific Framer Motion stuff or anything else having to do with front-end dev, or literally anything. Just let me know, and I'll put it on the list. I have hundreds of videos that I want to make that I haven't gotten to yet. But if there's something that is, a really strong suggestion, I generally prioritize that over other stuff. And that's going to be it. So I will see you guys next time. Peace.